Critics of conservative tax reforms like to point to Kansas. They say that state's recent budget struggles prove that tax cuts create too many problems. But our next guest offers an alternative view. Tax Gleason is Director of State Affairs at Americans for Tax Reform. His recent column for Forbes has the headline, "Forget Kansas, North Carolina is the national model for conservative tax reform." Patrick, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Mitch.
So you took a look at tax reform. As part of your job, you take a look at the effect of tax reform and tax burdens across the country. You say Kansas isn't really the model. North Carolina is the model. Why is that?
Yeah, so you've seen a lot of national media coverage about Kansas in recent years and in recent months particularly about what they've done on taxes and tax reform and what's been happening with their budget. And a lot of the focus has been on how Kansas has had budget deficits following the tax cuts passed in 2012, and there is a concerted strategy on the part of the National Democratic Party and left-of-center pundits and folks in the media to hold up Kansas as what they claim is the model of conservative tax relief, tax reform, and then they claim that this has led to the budget disaster or challenges that Kansas has faced. Well, that couldn't be farther from the truth for a number of reasons based on what has happened in Kansas. But I point to North Carolina as actually the model for what conservative, limited government, free market oriented tax reform looks like. So there's a lot of focus on Kansas, but actually North Carolina, both in terms of population and the economy, is 3 times the size of Kansas. Much more economically and politically important state. But it has gotten, although it's 3 times the size of Kansas, it's gotten a fraction of the attention, and that's unfortunate because it really deserves, frankly, more attention than Kansas, and certainly more than it's been getting. And what I point out is where Kansas made mistakes and went wrong and made bad decisions, North Carolina went the other way and made the right decision. So going back to 2012, Kansas cut taxes. Well, at the same time they cut taxes, they failed to rein in spending. When you're cutting taxes, you're going to have a reduction in government revenues. That's the whole purpose of cutting taxes. But they did not make the adjustment, and they did not cut spending. For case in point, 2012, the year that they cut taxes by $4.5 billion, that same year they increased spending by over $430 million, which represented a 7% increase in spending. Now, that's a recipe for disaster that precipitated and led to what ultimately were repeated budget shortfalls. Now, so they did not keep spending in check. Let's contrast that with North Carolina, which had the landmark just 1 year after Kansas's tax cuts. North Carolina enacted the landmark 2013 tax reform, significantly reducing personal and corporate tax rates, which before then had been the highest in the Southeast. So they brought those rates down, brought the top rate from 7.75% down to now where it is today, below 5.5% and going down further based on recent actions. And they took the corporate rate as well from 6.9 down to 3.3% where it is today, and it's set to go further down to 2.5% in 2019. But where North Carolina contrasts with Kansas is North Carolina kept spending in check. They budgeted conservatively. Unlike Kansas, after North Carolina cut taxes, they kept the growth in spending below the rate of growth in population inflation. And so what have we seen in North Carolina? At the same time that they've returned billions of dollars to taxpayers, to employers, to families across the state, at the same time they've done that, the state has experienced perennial budget surpluses, which have allowed them to enact subsequent rounds of tax relief, including this most recent budget just a few weeks ago. Not only does the state have surpluses, it's allowed the state to build the largest rainy day fund in state history, and it has a AAA credit rating. So North Carolina shows what a model for successful pro-growth tax reform and spending restraint looks like, and that's where Kansas missed the mark. They cut taxes, they failed to rein in spending, and as a result, they came back and actually ended up raising taxes.
We are chatting with Tax Gleason. He is the Director of State Affairs at Americans for Tax Reform, and obviously you're talking about a contrast here between Kansas and North Carolina. If other states are looking at the potential of tax reform, they ought to be looking at the way that North Carolina does it, shouldn't they? And not only looking at the tax side, but also that spending side.
Yeah, and so North Carolina is really a national model for what smart, conservative, responsible, pro-growth tax relief looks like. As I mentioned, while they were cutting rates, they were cutting some of the most economically damaging taxes, personal income tax, which also hits small businesses, the corporate rate, also getting rid of the death tax. But it is important, and this is what Kansas did not do. They kept spending in check. And I would say, the obsession with Kansas we see in the media, and also it's gotten up to the national level, where we were having a federal tax reform debate in Washington, D.C. right now, and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and national Democrats are referencing Kansas and saying, oh, this is a cautionary tale, why we can't cut taxes. Well, it's a diversionary tactic, and frankly, the obsession with Kansas and the misdirection by wanting to focus on Kansas shows what a weak hand Democrats and the left has to play on fiscal policy, because they have to hold up this one small state which made a number of mistakes and was in no ways a model for conservative tax and spending reform. They have to hold that state up because a more broader sampling of all 50 states it does not actually debunks what they're trying to claim, and shows that all other things being equal, lower rates of taxation lead to higher rates of economic growth, population growth, and income growth. So the obsession with Kansas shows what a weak hand they have to play. There's North Carolina, which is a counterexample that shows what to do and the good that can come out of that. There's also other counterexamples, Texas, Florida. Our neighbors to the west of here in Tennessee have been cutting taxes repeatedly in recent years, like North Carolina have had repeated budget surpluses. So there's a number of case studies that counter Kansas and rebut it. But then there's also the aggregate social science. And actually, John Locke Foundation Chairman John Hood has done a great job compiling all the academic research on fiscal policy and finding that by and large, most of the studies find that lower rates of taxation and spending are more conducive with economic growth and prosperity.
Now, the Democrats obviously have been focusing on Kansas, but as part of your job, you talk to people who are dealing with tax issues at the state level across the country. Are other states who are looking at tax reform, do they get it? Do they see that, hey, if we do it the way North Carolina does, we're going to be in better shape?
Yeah, so I spend my time and working in state capitals around the country in my role as the head of Americans for Tax Reform State Department. And what's interesting is there's a number of states looking at doing tax reform. They want to do rate-reducing tax reform because we're at this time of great competition between the states. And states need to make their fiscal policies and tax codes as conducive to economic growth and competitive as possible. So as a number of states are looking at tax reform, both later this year and into 2018, and as we saw earlier this year, states that were looking at that, the side that wanted to oppose tax cuts, they all kept talking about Kansas. Well, luckily, North Carolina and the example that they set was there, because if that were not the case, that Kansas cautionary scare tactic might have worked, but we were able to highlight North Carolina and say, no, here's an example of a state that did it right. So the rate-reducing tax reform that North Carolina has enacted has been great for the state in its own right, for economic growth in the state, for job creation, for attracting investment, new residents, but it's also had a national effect. So as other states that are looking to do rate-reducing tax reform, and also at the federal level in Congress, have looked to and been discussing what North Carolina has done, and when the other side tries to scare folks in other states from reducing tax rates by pointing to Kansas, we're able to point to North Carolina and say, no, there's a way to do it right. North Carolina has done it, and you should look to what they've done. So the Tar Heel State has really been a national leader in tax reform.
While we here in North Carolina pat ourselves on the back for the national example that we're setting, is it important that we also keep in mind that in the future, we still have to maintain the focus not just on what you're doing tax reform-wise, but also keeping a check on spending? Those two have to go hand in hand. You can't forget one if you're going to do the other.
Yeah, and actually, I think that is one thing we can learn from the Kansas example. The Kansas example can tell us what not to do, and it's when you're reducing spending when you're reducing tax rates, you also need to reduce spending and keep it in check, like North Carolina has done. So North Carolina has done that. The important thing is to continue doing that, continue budgeting conservatively, continue keeping the rate of spending growth below population inflation. And it's the economic golden rule Dan Mitchell from Cato Institute calls it, which is you want to make sure the economy grows faster than government. And right now, North Carolina has set the state on that path to success, adhering to the golden rule. The economy is growing faster than the state government, and that's why we've seen surpluses. That's why people are moving to the state. We're seeing domestic in-migration in North Carolina, not just people, but companies. And then the blue standard-bearer states, the high-tax states, that's what the media and Democrats, they don't want to talk about. They want to focus on the outlier at Kansas, because not only are there other states that debunk their arguments, like North Carolina, and show that lower tax rates are a recipe for success if you keep spending in check, but the blue Democrat standard-bearer states of Connecticut, New York, Illinois, high tax states that have been raising taxes. Illinois just raised their income tax 32% just last week. Oddly enough, similar and funny enough, Illinois has raised their income tax 32% just last week. Since 2013, North Carolina has cut theirs exactly 32%. So moving in diametrically opposing directions. But the blue states, the high tax states, people are voting with their feet. They are leaving those states. California, Illinois, New York, they are seeing a net outflow of people, of businesses, and they are taking income and wealth with them. And they're coming to states like North Carolina, like Tennessee, like Texas, like Florida, states that are reducing taxes. But unlike Kansas, not just reducing taxes, they're also reducing taxes and keeping spending in check, and also pursuing other smart reforms like regulatory reform like North Carolina has. So North Carolina has been a model for success on a host of policies, tax reform being the foremost, I would argue, and it's a state that other states should look to, and it's a state that members of Congress should look to as they take up federal tax reform later this year.